I feel like this is the first time that I'm getting to know more about you too.
Oh, okay.
So I guess, I feel like I know you, but
Yeah.
not a whole lot about, I guess, your background here in Houston.
Well, I grew up here in Houston. I wasn't born here, but we got here as soon as we could. I was very young when my parents moved here. And we've lived virtually that entire time in Third Ward. My dad still lives there, and so do my siblings.
So you know a little bit about the neighborhood then.
Yes, I do. I do.
Well, we're talking today obviously about 288 and 45, just freeways across Houston,
Right.
and how they expand as the city continues to grow. And you've seen this obviously growing up in Houston. I guess maybe some of your memories of freeway expansion and construction specifically in your neighborhood.
Well, I can tell you that they never stopped building the Gulf Freeway. They never stopped building the Katy Freeway, all of these different, thoroughfares that sort of make their way, form a spider web across the city. But I watched 288 going up late 70s, early 80s, around that time when they decided to build this highway from really inside the loop all the way out 288 to Pearland and Angleton and all of those then small areas, now huge burbs. But I remember specifically 288 because it literally split Third Ward in half. The area now where you've got multiple lanes of highway, there were homes, there were apartments. It was part of the universities that were there, TSU and U of H, and you literally watched those sort of divided as neighbors on both sides were pushed out of the way. And obviously land is cheap, people are poor, they don't have the same sort of ear of city officials that other neighborhoods do. But 288 continues to expand, and that neighborhood continues to be kind of chipped away as a result of that. And it's the same story in so many other parts of town.
Well, and you mentioned that's kind of the gist that I got from talking to people who have done research on these communities. It just continues to happen in those same communities. Obviously, those roads are there and they're permanently there, but those communities continue to be affected by that, and I guess displacement continues to happen. I guess what is the sentiment when you were watching this growing up from people in these communities who kept getting displaced?
Well, they were heartbroken, but in a lot of cases, people perhaps didn't own their own homes. They were more renters. Or if they did own their own homes, they figured they almost had to take the money because they couldn't afford to go without it. And so there's a tendency to feel, as you say, displaced, to feel unheard. And when you've got a city council that doesn't necessarily represent your neighborhood or, state highway department, there's not much you can do about it. But you do see the neighborhoods change dramatically as a result of not only freeways like the ones we've been talking about, but even redirecting streets or coming in and mowing down a couple of blocks of single family dwellings and replacing them with townhomes or with apartment complexes. We're definitely seeing that right now in Third Ward again as it becomes gentrified.
Yeah, and a lot of times these people, they don't have a voice.
Right.
We're here as journalists to give them that voice and tell their stories, doing stories like this, and hearing from someone like you who has grown up in those communities and heard, firsthand from some of these folks. But, I think that's a lot of the issue here is a lot of these people feel like they don't have a voice in maybe changing the routes or, redirecting it somewhere else.
Well, and that they're not listened to even when they're raising legitimate concerns. For instance, 288 floods all of the time, but when it was going up over the bayou there, that is Brays Bayou, a lot of people said, wait a minute, you realize that when the water rises it's going to flood the highways, but nobody's listening to them. And now of course we see it pretty systematically every time there's a heavy rain.
Yeah. Do you think there's anything that these people, I guess, could do as these highways continue to grow to get their voices heard?
I think it's easier to be heard now than it was, 20, 30 years ago, because you have social media, you have more representatives now. There are many more people, for instance, on city council than there were back in those days. And people even know how to use the media a lot better so that they can come to us and say, I want you to tell my story. Do I think it changes the eventual outcome? Not always, especially if you don't have money to back up your voice. But yeah, I mean, I think there are more opportunities. There may not necessarily be more favorable outcomes, though, and I think that's the heartbreaking part.
Yeah,
You lose neighborhoods that have such character and such history.
it is heartbreaking, and you being here so long, me only being here for just a couple of years, and just talking to these few people just for the story, you can really tell just from just a few people how heartbreaking it is.
Yeah, the pain that you can hear in people's voices, because this is where I grew up, this is where I raised my family, several generations. There's a perfect example of that in what was once Fourth Ward of Freedmanstown, now called Midtown, because one of the first things people always do is rename a neighborhood. But you had so many people there who were the descendants of slaves who'd lived there for a long time, but many of them were not owners, they were renters. And when Fourth Ward changed over, it was because there was a whole sort of series of events. There was the old Jeff Davis Hospital, which is now the Federal Reserve. There was something called Allen Parkway Village, which was low-income housing. And then there were all these row houses in Fourth Ward. Well, it just fell like dominoes. As soon as they closed Jeff Davis Hospital and tore that down, Allen Parkway Village went next, and then Fourth Ward went right behind that. And the owners of that neighborhood, many of the people that own property there, they were able to sell it for a handsome markup, but the people that lived there and who've lived there for decades were just kind of left out in the cold. So it's just the way it works, unfortunately.
Yeah, I can only hope that our stories, illuminate, some of the stuff that's happening in Houston, which it does.
Yeah, I'm sure it will. I know you're going to do a great job.